All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into the world of Ramon Llull, a
Right.
medieval philosopher, lived from 1232 to 1316. And, he's famous for a book called Magna, which was
Awesome.
his big attempt to create a logical system. But what makes it really interesting, especially for you, listening interested in philosophy, is that he wanted to use this system not just, to figure out the truth, but to have these interfaith dialogues, basically to convert people to Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing when you look at how much he actually wrote.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're talking over 200 texts in
Wow.
Catalan, Arabic, and Latin. And it's pretty impressive, especially for the time, that he actually used Catalan, his vernacular language,
Yeah.
for such complex philosophical ideas.
It really was ahead of its time. Yeah, and his life is just as interesting as his work.
Yeah.
So he was born into this, well-to-do family in Mallorca just after it was retaken from the Moors. And for a while, people thought he was, working in the palace, like as an administrator.
Right.
But it seems more likely now that he was just, involved in the family business. He got married, had kids. But then midlife, boom, he has this huge conversion experience.
Yeah, and that conversion is really the thing that kind of launches this entire philosophical project of his. I mean, he had these visions.
Really?
Yeah, and it was just this intense commitment. Like he was going to convert all these, what he considered to be unbelievers.
Wow.
He was going to systematically refute all their what he saw as errors.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wanted to establish these monasteries where people could learn languages so they could do this missionary work.
So dialogue, like rational dialogue between Christianity, Judaism, Islam, was like at the heart of this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was this idea of reaching some kind of universal understanding, which again was, for the time, pretty forward thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for you listening out there, especially if you're, if you're into philosophy, if you're interested in these big, fundamental questions about how we understand reality, this is going to resonate.
Definitely.
Because he's trying to build this universal model to understand reality, this framework for both philosophy and theology.
Yeah, that's really what it is. And for this deep dive, we're looking at mainly the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
All right.
They have this great entry on Ramon Llull. And what we're trying to do here is kind of get to the core of what his system was all about, and see what's in there that might be interesting for a philosopher like you.
Perfect. All right. So let's start with his big unifying vision. I mean, he wasn't just trying to, build a logic system. He was trying to connect philosophy, theology, even mysticism.
Yeah, it's really interesting how he saw these different, ways of knowing.
Yeah.
Not as separate things, but as interconnected. They were all part of this bigger picture.
And I guess, if you think about the time he was living in, this idea of unification makes even more sense, right?
Sure.
You have these conflicts with what he would have called infidels, the people outside of Christendom. But then you also have all this division within Christianity itself.
Absolutely. There's all these different factions and
Yeah.
schisms. And, for Llull, unification wasn't just an intellectual idea.
Right.
It was about strengthening the faith, bringing everyone together.
Yeah. And at the heart of this was his idea of this universal model to understand reality, this idea that you could, know God, understand God's actions, and also see how the whole of creation comes from God.
Right. And this is what forms the basis of his famous Rs.
Exactly.
Which, from a philosophical perspective, is it's incredibly ambitious.
Oh, yeah.
He wants it to be a method for finding the truth that would be accessible to everyone, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And his goal wasn't just, to have them agree.
Right.
He wanted to use it to convert them through, what he believed were necessary reasons, and also to really strengthen the Christian faith.
So how does he get started? How does he lay the groundwork for this huge project?
Well, he begins with, the idea that God exists.
Okay.
And that God is the source of everything. But then he brings in this concept from negative theology.
Negative theology.
Yeah, it comes from this guy, Dionysius the Areopagite. And basically it says that God is, fundamentally beyond our understanding.
So we can't really know God.
Right. Not directly. Not in his essence.
That seems like a pretty big problem.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Because if you're trying to create a system to understand reality, and God is the source of reality, how do you do that if you can't understand God?
Right. Right. So what does Lowell do? How does he get around this?
Well, he comes up with a really interesting solution. He says, okay, we can't grasp God's essence directly, but we can look at the qualities, the predicates that we use to describe the created world.
Mm-hmm.
And he says,
Okay, yeah, figure A. And then from these dignities, he develops something he calls principles, right?
exactly. He says these are like axioms based on the dignities, and they serve as like fundamental principles of both existence and action.
So how do they work as principles of existence?
Well, they stay pretty abstract. They kind of point back to the nature of the dignities.
Okay.
But then as principles of action, they become more concrete. They become like tools to apply the R's to different areas of knowledge.
Like what?
Like law or astrology or, whatever you're trying to understand. He even makes a distinction between absolute principles when you're thinking about them on their own and relative principles when you're applying them to a specific subject.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then he talks about how these principles act like a ladder. He uses that metaphor.
Oh, a ladder. For what?
A ladder for ascending and descending in knowledge.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Basically, you can use them to move between really general knowledge and very specific knowledge.
Got it.
So you could start with like a big overarching principle and use that to understand a particular thing. Or you can observe something very specific and then work your way up to the general principle behind it.
So it's like a way of connecting the general with the particular.
Exactly.
Now, I know he talks about this idea of a metaphysics of similarity. It sounds like he might have been influenced by St. Bonaventure there.
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities.
Okay, so what's the basic idea behind this metaphysics of similarity?
Well, Lowell thought that creation itself was like a mirror. It reflects the perfection of God.
Interesting.
Like it's a net of traces of the divine. And he says that things exist because they share some similarity with other things. And this similarity allows them to participate in the nature of higher beings, like the principles and the dignities.
So similarity is kind of the key to understanding how everything is connected.
Exactly. And he also uses the word signification for this.
Okay.
It's the way that God is manifest throughout creation.
So God is revealed through the similarities in creation.
Right. And this idea of signification doesn't just apply to God and creation.
What else does it apply to?
It applies to the relationships between all different levels of being. And that brings us to his idea of the ladder of beings.
Right, the ladder of beings. That's this hierarchical ordering of reality that we see a lot in medieval philosophy, right?
Absolutely.
So what did Lull's ladder look like? What were the main levels?
Well, he starts with the elementative level.
Okay, that's the 4 elements, right?
Right. Earth, air, fire, water. Then you go up to the vegetative, the sensitive, the imaginative man. Then heaven, angels. And at the top, of course, is God.
And the important thing is that they're all connected, right?
Yeah, they're connected by this idea of similarity. And because of that, you can move up and down the ladder in your quest for knowledge.
From the material to the spiritual and back again.
Exactly.
Now, he did add something to this ladder later on, didn't he?
Yeah, in his later work, he adds this category called instrumentality or artifice.
Okay.
And it goes below the elementative level.
So below the 4 elements, what's in this category?
It's all the things that humans make.
Ah, so human creations, tools, buildings, art, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It shows that he's thinking about human agency.
Right, our role in shaping the world. That's really interesting. Now, we should talk about his theory of the correlatives. This is where he kind of goes beyond just using analogies.
This is one of his more original contributions.
Okay, so for those of us who are into philosophy, what's the main idea here?
It's about the relationship between being and action.
Okay.
He says that what something is fundamentally defined by what it does.
So it's not just its static nature, but its activity.
Exactly.
It's a very dynamic way of thinking about being.
Right. And he actually breaks it down further. He says every being has 3 core aspects.
3 aspects?
Yeah, and he expresses them in these linguistic terms.
Okay.
So you have the active capacity, the tekivus,
Okay.
the capacity to be acted upon, the tekigos.
Okay.
And then the actual action or activity, the R.
All right, so give me an example.
Okay, so he uses this example.
Mm-hmm.
Bonificativus, bonificabilis, bonificar.
Those are like Latin words, right?
Yeah, and they mean basically that which makes good, that which can be made good, and to make good.
Okay, I see.
And for Lowell, these aren't just grammatical distinctions. These correlatives, they actually make up the essence of each being.
So it's like a thing's being is defined by its potential to act and be acted upon and its actual activity.
Exactly. And he applies this to human beings too. He says that we realize our potential through our faculties, our understanding, our memory, our will. And these faculties are guided by the correlatives of the principles, which ultimately reflect the divine dignities.
So everything goes back to those dignities, those perfections of God.
Right. And the correlatives, they also help explain how everything on the ladder of being is connected.
Right, that interconnectedness.
Yeah, it's like even though things might seem very different on the surface, they're all linked by these fundamental ways of acting and being acted upon.
And he even applies this to God himself, doesn't he?
Yeah, he says that the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit represent God's intrinsic action.
Okay.
And the dignities are God's extrinsic action, his outward expression that creates the universe.
That's really bringing everything together.
It is.
So let's move on to his theory of knowledge. I know he has a very particular definition of what it means to be human.
Yeah, he says that homo est animal homificans.
Man is a manifying animal. Okay, break that down for me.
Basically, he's saying that human beings are active by nature. Our fundamental principle is to know, to remember, to love. And these correspond to our faculties of understanding, memory, and will.
So it's about realizing our potential through these actions.
Exactly. It's not a passive view of human existence.
And what about self-knowledge? Where does that fit in?
He believed that self-knowledge was foundational. He thought that if you understand yourself, your own mind and will, then you can understand other people and ultimately God.
Interesting.
And he contrasts human knowledge with the knowledge of animals and angels.
Okay.
Animals, he says, are limited to their senses and imagination.
Right.
Angels, on the other hand, have this perfect intellectual self-awareness. But humans, we're in the middle. We have both a body and a soul. So we can use those principles we talked about to go up and down the ladder of being.
So we can experience both the physical and the spiritual realms.
Exactly.
And he outlines two ways of gaining knowledge, the path of ascent and the path of descent. Can you explain those a bit more?
Yeah, so the path of ascent starts with our senses. We perceive the world around us.
Okay.
Then our imagination takes those sensory experiences and creates internal images. And then our intellect works on those images to abstract knowledge about those external things.
So we're moving from the concrete to the abstract.
Right. And the path of descent goes the other way. It starts with universal principles.
Okay.
Things like goodness, truth, beauty. And then using those principles, our soul can recognize those same principles in specific things.
So we're moving from the general to the particular.
Exactly. And Llull saw these two paths as complementary. You need both of them to really understand reality.
Right. Now, he also talks about a sixth sense called a fetus. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's a pretty unique idea.
Okay, what is it?
Well, he defines it as the ability for an animal to express its thoughts through vocalization.
So communication.
Right. But he thinks it's more than just that. He thinks it's a way for our rational soul to communicate, even more so than the other senses.
Interesting.
He says it's how we produce meaningful sounds, how we communicate scientific knowledge, and even how we connect with God.
So it's like a higher form of communication.
Exactly. And it plays a key role in his overall theory of knowledge.
So if we put all this together, what's the full picture of how we gain knowledge according to Llull?
It's a cyclical process. It starts with self-knowledge, reflecting on yourself.
Okay.
Then you descend to the world to find the principles in things. Then you ascend back up, using your intellect to understand the nature of things.
Okay.
And finally, you reflect on your own intellect, and that leads you to the highest form of knowledge, the knowledge of goodness itself.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive process.
It is.
And it emphasizes this idea that knowledge isn't just passively receiving information.
Right. It's about actively engaging with the world using both your senses and your intellect. And he also talks about the importance of contemplation.
Okay, so it's not just observation, but reflection as well.
Exactly. Now, he also developed this doctrine of the transcendent points.
What's that?
It was his response to this theory called double truth.
Double truth.
Yeah, it came from Averroism. And basically it said that faith and reason could lead to different truths.
So what you believe based on faith could contradict what you know based on reason.
Right. And Llull didn't like that idea. He wanted to show that faith and reason were ultimately compatible.
Okay, so how did he do that?
He argued that truth, the real truth, goes beyond what we can fully grasp with our limited human minds. He said there are 3 types of knowledge objects: sensitive, intellective, and divine.
So sensitive knowledge is what we get from our senses, right?
Right? It's limited to the particular things we experience.
Okay.
Intellective knowledge, that's science and philosophy. It's more abstract, but still limited.
Uh-huh.
And then divine knowledge, that's the knowledge of God, of the dignities. That's the highest form of knowledge.
And that's where we get closest to the real truth.
Exactly. And he connected these different levels of knowledge to the types of logical arguments he used in the RCs.
Okay, so what were those arguments?
He used the standard Aristotelian ones like propter quid, where you go from cause to effect, and quia, where you go from effect to cause.
Right.
But then he also developed his own type of argument called argumentum per equiparantium.
Which means?
Proof by equivalence.
Okay.
Basically, you show that something is true by showing that it's equivalent to something else that's already known to be true.
Got it. So all of this was part of his big project, the R's.
Exactly. The R's is really the culmination of all of his thinking.
And it's basically a combinatorial logical system, right?
Right. It's about combining things in different ways to discover truth.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does it work?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the R's went through different stages.
Okay.
He started with what we call the quaternary phase.
Quaternary.
Yeah, it was based on the 4 elements.
Right. Earth, air, fire, water.
Exactly. And some of the key texts from this period are the Ars Compendiosa and the Ars Demonstrativa.
Okay.
And then he moved to the ternary phase,
Ternary.
which was based on the Trinity.
Oh, okay.
And that's where we get the Ars Generalis Ultima and the Ars Brevis.
And the Ars Brevis is the one that became really famous, right?
Yeah, that's the one that a lot of people know.
Now, you said before that Llull wanted to use the R's for interfaith dialogue to convert people.
Right.
But it wasn't like he was just trying to shove Christian dogma down people's throats, right?
No, he was actually quite strategic about it.
Okay.
He built the R's on principles that he thought were common to all 3 Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
So shared ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His idea was to show that if you accept these basic principles and then you use the R's to think about them rigorously, you'll end up with a Christian view of God.
That's a very clever approach.
It is.
Yeah.
And he was also quite critical of the scholastic logic that was popular at the time.
Really? What didn't he like about it?
Well, first of all, he thought that syllogisms, which were the main tool of scholastic logic, were too limited.
Okay.
He said they could only explain things you already knew.
Yeah.
They couldn't lead to new discoveries.
Interesting.
And secondly, he thought that syllogisms focused too much on second intentions.
Second intentions.
Yeah, that's the logical relationships between concepts within propositions.
Okay.
He thought they should be focusing on first intentions.
Which are?
The actual things themselves, the objects of reality.
So he wanted a logic that was more grounded in the real world.
Exactly.
So he creates the R's to be this new kind of logical system.
Right. He wanted it to be able to discover new truths, new metaphysical truths. And he described it as compendioso, inventivo, demonstrativo, and general.
Okay, let's break those down. What do they mean?
Compendioso means concise.
Okay.
You can get a lot of arguments out of a small number of principles.
Right. Inventivo.
Inventive.
Yeah.
It can be used to generate new arguments, new insights.
Okay. Demonstrativo.
Demonstrative. It leads to logically necessary conclusions.
In general.
General means it can be applied to a wide range of things, both real and logical.
So this is a system that can help you understand anything.
That was the idea. And to do this, he uses these different elements: terms, figures, and in the later versions, an alphabet.
Okay, so the terms are like the basic concepts, right?
Right. Things like the dignities, the principles.
And the figures.
The figures are diagrams, like circles and tables and geometric shapes.
Okay.
And they're used to visualize how the terms can be combined.
And the alphabet.
That comes in later in the ternary R's. It's a special alphabet with 9 letters.
9 letters.
Yeah, and each letter has multiple meanings attached to it.
So you can use these letters to create different combinations and explore different ideas.
Exactly.
All right, so let's look at the figures in the quaternary phase. You've got figure A, which represents the dignities.
Right.
Figure S, which represents the soul. Figure T, which focuses on relationships. And figure V, which deals with virtues and vices. How do all these figures work together?
Well, each figure is like a map of a different domain.
Okay.
So figure A shows you the dignities and how they're related to each other. Figure S maps out the different parts of the soul and its actions. Figure T is all about the different kinds of relationships that can exist between things.
Right.
And figure V lists the virtues and vices.
Got it.
And the way they work together is through this process that Llull called enter.
Enter.
Yeah, it means like to combine.
Okay.
So you take the concepts from different figures and you see how they interact.
So, for example?
Well, you could use figure S to think about the soul, and then use figure V to think about how the soul can overcome vices and cultivate virtues.
Uh-huh.
And then you can use figure A and figure T to think about how divine perfection and justice can help in that process.
So it's like you're weaving together different strands of thought.
Exactly. And he even developed some new figures later the quaternary phase.
Like what?
The elemental figure, which uses the 4 elements as an analogy for understanding things.
Okay.
And then the demonstrative figure, which is more abstract and universal.
So he's refining the system as he goes along.
He is. He's always trying to make it more powerful, more comprehensive.
And then he makes this big shift to the ternary R's, right?
That happened after he went to Paris and got some pushback on his ideas.
Okay, so what were the main changes in the ternary R's?
Well, he simplifies things.
How so?
He reduces the number of figures from 7 down to 4.
Wow, that's a big change.
It is. And he also shifts the focus from the 4 elements to the Trinity.
So it becomes more explicitly theological?
Yeah, you could say that. But he also introduces this 9-letter alphabet.
Right, we talked about that before. And each letter has 6 different meanings, right?
So, for example, the letter B could represent goodness, difference, the question whether, God, justice, or avarice.
Wow, that's a lot packed into one letter.
It is. But it makes the system incredibly flexible. You can generate a huge number of combinations and explore all sorts of different relationships.
So how do these 4 figures in the ternary R's actually work with this alphabet?
Okay, so the first figure is pretty simple. It's just a circle with the first meaning of each letter. The second figure uses 3 circles and some triangles to represent the second meaning of each letter, along with its different types or species.
Uh-huh.
The third figure is a square divided into 9 sections.
Okay.
And it's used for making binary combinations of the letters.
So you take 2 letters and see what you can get out of them.
Exactly. And the fourth figure uses 3 circles that you can rotate.
Okay.
And it's used for making ternary combinations of the letters.
So 3 letters at a time.
Right.
Wow.
And there's also a table that lists all the possible combinations.
So how do you actually use the ternary R's? You mentioned something called evacuating the third figure. What does that mean?
Okay, so evacuating the third figure is about getting all the possible meanings out of the binary combinations.
Okay.
So you take 2 letters and you make statements using all the different meanings of those letters.
Wow.
You switch the subject and predicate around.
Okay.
And you ask questions based on the third meaning of the letters, which is the question word.
So you're really squeezing every drop of meaning out of those 2 letters.
Exactly. And you can end up with 36 different meanings or questions for each pair of letters.
That's a lot.
It is. And then you have the definitions and the rules.
Okay, what are those for?
The definitions help you understand the basic meanings of the terms.
Okay.
But Llull defines things in a very specific way. He defines them based on their activity, not their genus and species.
Interesting.
And then the rules are linked to the question words.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell you what kind of answer you should be looking for, depending on the question.
So they guide your inquiry.
Exactly. And then you have multiplying the fourth figure.
Okay, what happens there?
You take those ternary combinations from the fourth figure.
Right, the 3 letters.
Right. And you ask 20 specific questions for each combination.
Wow.
And those questions are based on all the different meanings of the letters.
So you're really digging deep into the relationships between those concepts.
Yeah, and then you use the definitions and the rules to try to answer the questions.
This whole system is incredibly complex.
It is.
Yes.
But it's also very systematic.
So at the end of the day, what's the point of all this? What was Llull trying to achieve with the R's?
He wanted to give people a tool for solving problems and building arguments.
Okay.
But not just any arguments. He wanted arguments that were based on reason, not authority.
So you have to think for yourself.
Exactly. And he emphasized the importance of being clever, of being a good thinker.
And of having good intentions, right?
Right. Because he believed that the R's could be used for good or for evil.
So it's a powerful tool that needs to be used responsibly.
Exactly.
Well, Ramon Llull was certainly an ambitious thinker. This whole system he created, this
Yeah.
universal model to understand reality, it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah, he was trying to do something that no one had ever done before.
And I think for anyone who's into philosophy, there's so much to explore in his work. This idea of interconnectedness, his theory of knowledge, the logic of the R's.
Definitely. And even though he was writing in the 13th century, his ideas still resonate today.
Absolutely. He's asking these big questions about truth, knowledge, the universe, questions that we're still grappling with.
Exactly. And I think he offers a unique perspective, a historical perspective, that can really enrich our understanding of those questions.
Yeah, I agree. So for you listening out there, I want to leave you with this question. How does Lull's project, this attempt to create a logical system for understanding,